Hello and welcome to Focus 54, your weekly guide to real African news. And today is a special edition, undoubtedly our biggest episode of the year as we celebrate Africa Day. And we're excited to drive a special discussion today on this very significant day and assess our progress towards achieving Africa's African Union Agenda 2063. And joining me in this conversation today, it's a heated conversation. And I feel humbled to have two esteemed gentlemen in studio, Rutendo Matinyarare, a passionate Pan-African and advocate of peace and justice in Africa, as well as Professor Rukuni, renowned educationist and expert in African history and development. Gentlemen, welcome back to Focus 54.
Thank you.
Nice to be back.
It's good to have you. And Professor, I like how you addressed, we read the memo very well.
For me, every day is Africa Day.
Every day is Africa Day. Now, today we're going to be exploring the theme of this year's Africa Day, which is justice for Africans and people of African descent through reparations. And this has challenges and opportunities that we're going to talk about. And it's all about the pursuit of a united, prosperous, peaceful, and I would say mentally sovereign Africa. We had a discussion off air talking about African consciousness and the rebirth of the modern Africa. Now, just speaking on this theme, having the justice for Africans and people of African descent through reparations, given the injustices of slavery, colonialism, and exploitation in Africa that is Africa has faced and is facing in some parts of Africa, what is meant by reparations in this context, and what kind of justice do we envision for Africans today and going forward? I'll start with you, Prof.
With me? Oh yeah. So you see, it's been a decade, at least a century since major colonization by European countries. So almost every African country was impacted one way or another. There are certain issues that cut across all the African countries, or almost all, like slavery, colonization. But some are specific to specific countries. So we do have scope here for individual nations, countries to push their reparations agenda. But the biggest agenda of all is overall kind of transformative justice for the whole continent. And that has to be dealt with through some cooperation. And it's great that the African Union is pushing for this Africa Common Position on reparations so that we cut across all the major issues, not just slavery, but colonization itself. There was a lot of cultural genocide, et cetera, that I'm sure we're going to talk about today.
Yes. Rutendo, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, and I think the biggest problem that many people have is they never really get to understand how it is that Africa was put on a back foot through colonialism and slavery. Mm-hmm. A lot of Africans think that there was no slavery in Southern Africa, but about 2 million slaves were taken from Southern Africa. Mm-hmm. There's an area called Kanyemba up in the north border, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and Zambia. They took slaves, about 2 million from there, all the way through the Ogoa Bay, which is Maputo today. Mm-hmm. And then you also look at what colonialism did. When I looked at the cost of what it is that colonialism cost us, the taxes that our parents were forced to pay or our ancestors were forced to pay. You look at the cattle that they lost. Then you look at the land that was taken and used by the Europeans without any return to them, and the gold. And we are looking at Zimbabwe having lost $1 trillion and more just from the period of. And if you understand what colonialism is, it's an extraction of resources by force. So your people are used to extract the resources. Their cattle are taken. They're forced to pay taxes that do not develop the rural areas, but are used to build railway lines to extract resources from these countries. The gold alone that was extracted from this country is over $80 billion. Then we've got chrome, we've got all these other things. And without quantifying them and understanding that there was no reinvestment into the future for the extraction of these mineral resources, you understand that we lost, because now when we want to extract these resources, they are harder to reach. They're almost depleted in some instances, and the good and easy to access resources have been taken. They were used to create infrastructure by the Rhodesians. But now us today, for us to build this country with those resources, we have to pay real wages. We cannot enslave. For us to build railways, we have to pay real wages. We have to pay for the steel. We have to pay for everything. Unlike the colonial period where they stole what they wanted and they used our people as cheap labor, it was easy for them to do that. So for us to fix that, we need reparations. We need restitution in Integram for us to be able to take ourselves forward.
Now, I like that we have actually set the tone of what this Africa Day is going to be about. And for the first time, we take a very early break, because when we come through, we're going to get into the hard line of some very difficult discussions, discussions about debt, discussions about why you are born in debt, why every time you always hear that certain African nations have increasing taxations and increasing interest on loans. And you wonder, if we are the richest continent in the world, why are we owing everyone everything? Stay tuned. Back to the second segment of Focus 54. We are zoning in on Africa Day, and we were discussing reparations. Now, Rutendo, I know we spoke about the need for reparations and these sort of reforms. Now, let's speak about the modern day effect of what slavery, colonialism, and injustices across the African board. Now, there's ongoing economic structures that perpetuate inequality in Africa, and such as unequal trade agreements and foreign debt. I'll give an example of one colonizer in Africa. We've seen and we're now seeing, or we've always known, the atrocities of French colonialism and what it did to the economy. To this day, the French government owns quite a significant portion of African resources. How do we turn these things around, especially on Africa Day?
We've got to first of all identify the institutions that are used to institute this inequality you talk about. So we've got institutions like the IMF, we've got institutions like the Bank of International Settlements, World Bank, and then we've got something called the Financial Action Task Force that is there to try and stop the flow of money from Africa, from the Western world where our people are living, and that money being repatriated back to Africa. Try to stop investors who want to invest from Europe into Africa by saying that that money is it's proceeds of money laundering or the financing of terrorism, or it has to be vetted to ensure that it's not funding terrorism or some form of money laundering. But what is so surprising is we recently heard that USAID was funding Boko Haram. The money was being transmitted from USAID through American banks, through the European banks, through to fund these terrorists in Nigeria. But we did not see a single blank in Europe or America being put on the grey list of the Financial Action Task Force. We did not see the financial systems of those countries being grey listed like what we see in South Africa, but yet they were funding terrorism. South Africa, just because it has not been paying attention to money that could be flowing from there to other countries and funding terrorism on a suspicion, has been grey listed. These are institutions that are there to stop Africa's development, and they're not there to stop terrorism. They're not there to stop illicit flows of capital, as long as the money is going to the West instead of coming to Africa and benefiting African. So these are institutions we need to deal with. And we need to also look at the impact of neocolonialism. Zimbabwe was under sanctions for 24 years. Those sanctions destroyed the infrastructure and the economy of Zimbabwe. The sanctions were a crime against humanity. They were illegal at international law. Reparations must be paid for that as well. But at the same time, we look at the climate we're living in. The Western world wants to recolonize Africa. And our leaders seem oblivious to that. And so if we are going to be oblivious to this recolonization, How do we even pursue reparations when the West is trying to repeat what they did before because there were no consequences?
I'd very much like to argue that point, and I'm going to ask the professor to zone in on that. There are some youngsters these days say woke, or people that are awake in terms of what's going on, and I will speak of Ibrahim Traore, who seems to be the beacon of economic revolution in the Sahel region, with countries such as Mali and Burkina Faso getting themselves away from French grip and getting in touch, in fact, having full control of their resources, and some countries even getting rid of debt. Are there any success stories and such leaders across the African continent that are turning this around, these economic injustices, and now starting to talk about reparation?
Well, before we get to the reparations part of the issue, the thing is, admirable as it is what President Traore is doing, there's still one important characteristic of every economy in Africa that he also even needs to be aware of. Because I've been across Africa, and none of the governments are aware that they are in a middle income trap. Either you're in low income trap or middle income trap, because every one of the economies is a dual economy. So it doesn't matter how much good governance and how much structural transformation you try to push. The point is the majority of your population is disconnected from manufacturing, industrial, commercial purposes, because the colonials just had a small proportion of them doing the commercial farming and supplying the factories. So the industrial sector never grew to a point where it can carry the rest of the population in those services. So we have rapid urbanization, but there are no jobs. There's no manufacturing. So urbanization is being caused by poverty and going into the urban areas to actually just get better services.
Okay.
But no manufacturing. So that's the most important. 55 out of 55 countries in Africa, none have made it into a fully industrialized economy. And trade is not going to do it. Part of the reparations, therefore, is to restructure these economies. We want long-term systemic change. We want economic sovereignty. In other words, we want to go back to what would have happened if the British had not colonized my country, Zimbabwe. Okay. And we have the Portuguese before them. The Portuguese failed to colonize because they were militarily defeated by Zimbabweans. They were defeated militarily, spiritually, the whole lot, and retreated and started to trade under our arrangements. And we prospered into an advanced civilization. If the British, 100 years later, when they came through in 1890, if they'd come in to trade with us rather than to colonize us.
Maybe we're talking about a different story now?
As Rutendo was saying, I've done a back of envelope calculation, would be at least a $300 billion economy annually, at maybe even $4 to half a trillion.
Well, it's
Yes.
African nature that when we have disagreements or one has wronged the other, people sit down, and nowadays we call these truth and reconciliation commissions. As a continent, can we have those so that we can reset the tone for an industrialized, economically emancipated Africa?
I think before we make it an African thing, it's an international thing. Because if you remember, there was the Marshall Plan. There were reparations paid to countries after the Second World War. Even Asian countries got reparations, and they got financial assistance to get themselves out of the rut of the Second World War. Even the countries that were said to have perpetrated the Second World War, and I say said to have perpetrated because the Europeans are known to have perpetrated that war, for them to get control of the international financial system. But let us say that the Japanese and the Germans were said to have perpetrated they were beneficiaries of the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan was underpinned and financed by the continuous oppression of African countries and the continuation of colonialism. The resources of Africa were taken and they were used to re-industrialize the world. So there has to be a funding system and a deliberate effort to industrialize countries. Technology was taken from the West, given to the Japanese. Technology was taken from the West, given to the Chinese for them to be where they are today. And many people don't realize this. There had to be an education system. There had to be exchange of skills. Lecturers would come from Europe, They would go into Japan, from America. Even machinery and technology was exported to these countries. While that is happening in Europe, it's because Africa is supposed to be a low-cost resource center. They deliberately do not give you the same. They don't allow you to get the machinery and technology to industrialize. They don't teach you how to industrialize. And one of the reasons is because we remain fragmented little markets. Until we become one consolidated market of 1.4 billion people that can be seen as a marketplace and also a labor force for that marketplace to manufacture the things that are needed to go into that market, no one has an incentive to industrialize Africa but to continue to extract resources from there. And then just on the point of Traore, we've never given adequate credit to a woman called Arikana Chihombori, who is a Zimbabwean, who started this revolution within the Francophone countries by talking about the oppression. When she was at the UN, she made it a big issue to talk about how France was still recolonizing Africa and why France was damaging Africa and extracting taxes. And she lit something in the hearts of those young men that you're now seeing in the Sahel undertaking the coups. And we understand the Ouattara in Cote d'Ivoire could also be in trouble because we understand that there could have been yes.
So what
that fire by Arikana Chihombori has really ignited something in the Francophone countries that might actually see true independence for those countries in the future.
Well, one thing we like to do on this show is we like to light a match so that the fire starts burning. And we'll give you just a few minutes for you to digest all that we're talking about. And remember, we are still celebrating Africa Day. We are not bemoaning all of the injustices that have happened in this lovely continent. And when we get back, we want to talk about some of the success stories and the possible solutions that we will be having in Africa. As we attain Agenda 2063, where will Africa be in a couple of decades? Stay tuned. Hello and welcome back to the third and final segment of Focus 54, the special edition where we are celebrating Africa Day. And we did talk about the issue and the urgent need for reparations and an agenda to turn around the injustices that have happened to Africa. But while all of this is being said, Africa is moving, Africa is growing. It does have the largest proportion and the largest demography of young people. And if you ask anyone, they'll tell you that food processing and value chain addition is the next frontier for millionaires and the new millionaires in Africa. Now, speaking of trade and some of the wins that we've had, this acronym that talks about the African Continental Free Trade Areas has been spoken about. It has been a strategy that is discussed in different fora. Quite recently, Namibia and Zambia have had a land gifting ceremony that has allowed Zambia and Namibia to have a dry port, a portion of land that has been gifted to the Zambians to have a dry port and making it easier for goods to come through from the west into Zambia. These are some of these examples. Rwanda has opened its borders to all Africans. You don't need visas. I believe Uganda now has even a direct flight from Zimbabwe to Uganda. We're seeing a lot of this and a lot of these, I would say consolidation of little wins. Is this the new agenda for Africa as we're getting into some form of internal economic emancipation for the 1.4 billion people that are in the continent?
There are some very positive things happening on the continent. However, Africa still manufactures only 1.5% of all manufactured goods in the world, which means when we push the Africa Free Trade Area Agreement, we are basically talking about maybe trading 1% of manufactured goods and services. The rest are raw materials. We're moving around grains, this, that, and the other. That's not going to take us very far. So we should not lose sight of the fact that this free trade agreement, honestly, can only move forward to take us to be the next major superpower in the world through pushing manufacturing. So you mentioned China and Japan before it. Those two nations, if Africa is going to see how those did it, besides the technological elements mentioned, history, the Chinese and the Japanese can look back into their history and they know where they came from 5,000 years before. They can look back and see where they're coming from. And therefore they can see a few hundred years ahead of them. We Africans have lost that capacity. It was taken away from us. You only look as far back as when we were colonized. Okay. So if you can't look far back enough, you won't be able to build that desired future. So I'm quite clear in my mind that the African Union's efforts, laudable, but the colonial master made sure of one thing: negotiate independence in a way that ties you down for. They bought themselves time, please. Let's just be honest.
They did.
They bought even late ones like us, Zimbabwe 1980. We still signed that Lancaster House Agreement. Is the most immoral piece of agreement. It ties you down to things that will allow them to continue to control this economy. So you got political independence, but economic sovereignty is what we need. We want to ensure that we dilute this dual economy we have in Zimbabwe, and ensure that any average person in the village. We were before the British came here. Every village, we could brew beer, we could milk cows. We were doing all those things. Almost every product you see in the supermarket was being produced one way or another. How many steps to manufacturing? Maybe 2-3 steps. Just shelf life, put it in a plastic, and this way. So if those had been upgraded, everyone would be in an industrial economy. So reparations are to do with getting back to a situation where we change the structure of the economy. It doesn't matter how many elections you hold. It doesn't matter you get rid of corruption. That won't take you out of a middle income trap. What takes you out is changing the structure of the economy so that even the rural areas are fully connected through infrastructure, power, water, giving them capacity to manufacture at village, township, growth point level. Then the whole economy is connected. That's how the Chinese did it. That's what every African country needs to do. Then we can start trading manufactured goods and services.
One thing I like about having, thank you so much, Professor, for that one. And one thing I love about having Rutendo in a panel discussion is he can pragmatically articulate the uncomfortable truth. Gentlemen, as we discuss all of these things, we can speak about this, write books and books about this. How will all of this work without an African central bank? And Rutendo, why is it that global powers are threatened by the idea of an African central bank in which Egypt can loan money to Mali to build a manufacturing hub for medicine, where Zambia can loan coal to the DRC so that they can start making cars? Why is the idea of an African central bank a threat to the global system?
We stop using their banks, the World Bank and the IMF. And once we stop using those banks, we are no longer indebted by their institutions, which have been using this debt to control our economies and to tell us what kind of policies to employ. But for me, before we start talking about the World Bank and the IMF, we need to talk internally. Right now, I've realized in Zimbabwe there is this culture of denigrating our black created business people. We've got them being targeted, being called names, Zigananda, and so forth and so on. We cannot have an economy where black people hate their own black business people. You cannot have a situation where black people hate the bankers of their country, the investors with the investment companies in the country.
Yet in the same system, we are fed the education of praising the Rockefeller families and they used to call them the Four Horsemen. These were the same as what we have now.
And we don't only praise the Rockefellers, we praise local white people who have been thieving in this economy. When we did not have fuel, they did not try to provide fuel for this country. When we did not have the certain banking services, these white people sabotage this economy. Then we have got black business people who are rising. They build banks, They're lending money to agriculture. They're lending money to production of wheat. We start calling them names. We've got to break down that culture because it's a colonial culture of hating our own on the belief and pretext that a black man can only be rich.
So is it
by
spread
being a
across other
criminal.
African countries? I mean, I know you understand the South African economy very well.
Same thing.
Central African economy as well. East African economy. Is it something? Is it a cancer that we need to work on as Africa before we have our central bank?
It's a cancer in Zimbabwe. In South Africa, they will praise the black people who were created by the whites. So these were black people who were given vendor finance. They were given finances. They are fronts for the black for the white elite. They will be praised. They will be given a lot of accolades. But the black businessman who makes himself from nothing to something, they usually will find a way to destroy that person. It's an African problem. And in Southern Africa, it's even more serious because we were the last to be colonized. We're still a very colonized people who hate anything that is African. So we cannot expect to have a Central African bank because right now we've got Afrexim Bank.
Yes.
Zimbabwe is a shareholder in there, together with Egypt and Nigeria. That is already remnants in the beginning of an African bank.
So
Right.
you've got mineral-rich Zimbabwe, oil-rich Nigeria, intellectual and trade-rich Egypt.
Egypt, they started a bank. And this bank was started by our very own, Mangunja was one of the people that started this bank. We don't give him credit. He's now started the Mutapa Fund, where he's growing a fund that is going to be able to finance the development of our industries and our parastatals, like what they've done in Ethiopia, where they've built the biggest airline, Ethiopian Airways, that overtook South African Airways, because Ethiopia is funding this Ethiopian Airways with a sovereign wealth fund. And then we frown upon it when it's being done in Zimbabwe, on the pretext that Mangunjka doesn't know what he's doing. But yet he was one of the founders of the African Bank. We need to believe in our own people.
So now, as we celebrate Africa Day, I see that we are of different generations and born in different timelines. The young people. I know people talk about AMA 2000. You've got the 20-year-olds, 25-year-olds, people under 30, under 35. These are our most economical and most critical population. What mindset can we give them to say, guys, you're an amazing group because you're in Africa. These are the opportunities. This is the way for you to grow from where we are to where we want to be in 2063.
My generation, definitely we are to blame for not ensuring that the educational system transformed well enough. Even our parenting systems never gave a chance for us to really get the next generation to understand where we are coming from and where we are trying to go. So that has to be corrected. The educational system, religions that we adopted are not helping. Families are split on political lines, religion, education, who has got money. The mutual respect which we used to have in our system has to be restored. Part of the reparations or restorations is cultural, because if there's no self-respect, it's very difficult to then have a common intergenerational way of seeing a desired future. So I think we need that. And if you don't mind, I would throw in just one final thing. I was inspired by Rutendo's comment, especially on the bank. If the Africa Union was going to help us to quickly get intergenerational healing and ensure that we should push the cultural restoration elements up front. But I would think what the decisions that our leaders need to make won't take even 2 hours. If all our 55 heads of state sat and made 2 resolutions. First resolution, we are going to have a common foreign policy. Okay. It doesn't matter what, we will sit and say this is our position on China, our position on a common foreign position, foreign policy would really help Africans to start having a much clearer identity and common base for respect. Second resolution I would recommend is a resolution which tells the rest of the world an injury to any one African is an injury to all of us, so wherever they are. If you injure an African, you will hear from us. We won't even trade with you. We won't even talk to you. These are the types of resolutions that the Africa Union has to start with to make sure that the rest, especially the economic, will then make sense.
I find myself in a very difficult situation because we are now right at the peak of our discussion with these two great minds that are joining me in studio, Rutendo Matinyarare and Professor Rukuni. I would like to sum up everything that we're celebrating today as Africa Day with the spirit of Ubuntu. By clear definition, I am because you are. Yeah. And this is the spirit that we would like to always share with you on Focus 54. Give us your thoughts on this episode. And if you would like us to get deeper into some of these very difficult and uncomfortable discussions, you can get in touch with us on our social media pages, on our YouTube channel, on our Facebook page, on our Twitter and our LinkedIn as well. Would really like to have your comments and have you directing the discussions that we want to have in Africa. For Focus 54, my name is Jeffrey Murimbechi. Catch me next time.
Join us live on ZBC TV as President Emmerson Mnangagwa launches the Zimbabwe media policy. With the objective to promote professionalism, capacitate the media industry, and enforce a comprehensive code of ethics, the national media policy will be launched at State House on the 28th of May 2025. Don't miss the launch of the Zimbabwe media policy live on ZBC TV. Join the conversation and shape the future of the media industry in Zimbabwe.